I have a guest tonight that I would like to introduce you guys to, Randall Carlson. As a third-generation professional builder and a high-ranking Freemason for over 27 years, Randall Carlson is well-versed in systems of design and construction. Didn't realize he was a Freemason. We'll have to ask him about that. In addition to being a master builder and architectural designer, Carlson has devoted over 35 years to the study of these arcane systems. Employed by the ancients, exploring the interface between ancient mysteries and modern science. Beginning his studies of sacred geometry in the early 1970s, Carlson delivered his first lecture on the subject in 1980. Since then, he has taught the philosophy, principles, and methods to hundreds of people in numerous classes, workshops, and lectures to thousands, demonstrating the value and importance of the subject in a wide range of applications. The acclaimed 1997 documentary Fire from the Sky was based on his research into Earth in the fields of astronomy, geology, and history, and he was honored by the National Science Teachers Association for his commitment to science education. Carlson's current research involves in-depth study of Earth and climate change, as well as the application of ancient knowledge to the task of creating a better modern world. In 1998, he led 18 research investigating catastrophic Earth changes and other ancient mysteries, and continues doing so regularly. He resides in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Randall Carlson tonight to the show. After we get back from a quick break, I just wanted to introduce him, and then we'll bring him on live with us right when we get back. We'll ask him what is sacred geometry. We'll talk about his catastrophism. How do you say that? Catastrophism. That's how I want to say it. Catastrophism. This show is sometimes catastrophic. All right, don't go anywhere. It is the Bob Tuskin Show. We'll be back with our special guest in just moments. Lots to talk about with our special guest tonight, Randall Carlson. Sacred geometry. What the hell is it? Well, we'll ask him that and so much more. And joining us now is Randall Carlson. Randall, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Well, we talked about it briefly on the show last week, only really scratched the surface, and we went into a couple different directions, covering some of your works. Let's start off, though, however, with just sacred geometry and a basic overview of the subject of sacred geometry.
All right. Well, sacred geometry is the study of the patterns that unite all phenomena of creation. So we can find sacred geometry in molecular geometry. We can find it in human anatomy. We can find it throughout the biological realm. We can find it in the geological and astronomical realms, and we can also find it manifested in temporally in cycles of time. So it's pretty broad and diverse. This term, I think, evolved in the 20th century. I don't know if it was actually used by ancient people or not, but in the early 20th century, there were some researchers, J. Hambidge and George Lesser and Tons Bruns and a number of others that devoted many years to trying to recover the geometric systems at work used primarily by the ancient builders. J. Hambidge's work addressed primarily the use of geometry by artists rather than builders, but it turned out that they were essentially using the same system. And so there was a system that was derived for the purposes of creating art and architecture, yet the principles that it manifested were essentially derived from the natural world. So it pretty much went into decline as we get post-Renaissance times. The last great apotheosis of sacred geometry was probably the Gothic building era during the Middle Ages, and we sort of see it diminishing in importance. It went through an artistic revival during the Renaissance times, and then as we post-scientific revolution, it sort of fell into disuse. Part of the problem was a lot of the traditions were propagated only from master to student, and generally in secret. So as we get to about the turn of the 20th century, the system had pretty much been lost.
Why is that, Randall? Why the secrecy? Is it because they feel that certain people can't handle the information and that kind of thing?
Well, I think there's multiple reasons. One reason would be simply trade secrets, why we still have secrets today, why, corporations will protect the information about their products and services and so on. But we also have to remember that a lot of this was being propagated during times when there was no such thing as an unrestricted free flow of knowledge. And if one deviated even slightly from the accepted orthodoxies of the time, one could get into a lot of trouble. Heresy was considered to be a major crime. And so many of these groups that had these beliefs also had theological systems that went along with it that maybe were outside of, what was accepted orthodoxy at the time. And so I think that was a big part of the reason a lot of this was secret. A lot of the Renaissance art masters had their secret methods of laying out proportioning grids and so forth for their great works. And again, those were sort of their unique province, which they protected somewhat jealously and would only pass on.
Well, I can see your points. I could certainly see your point. Sorry to interrupt about secrecy and the usefulness of it in certain cases. But on the other hand, I can also see how people are quite weary of that. How they feel that knowledge that is hidden for a reason, and a lot of times it's underground because of some sort of sinister, malevolent element to it. Now, Freemasonry is often accused of that sort of thing, and you're a 32-degree Freemason. Would you like to go ahead and get that out of the way and discuss that with us?
Well, I safely say by their works you shall judge them, but to those who would like to cast malevolent aspersions on the craft of Freemasonry, I would ask them to show me any kind of hard evidence besides conspiratorial fantasies. Now, this isn't to say that throughout history there haven't been Freemasons that have played prominent positions in public life and so forth, but there have also been lots of Southern Baptists and Quakers and Mormons and Methodists, and you could take any group and find influential public figures who are a member of that group and create a conspiracy. What makes Freemasonry particularly susceptible is the tradition of secrecy that is associated with the craft. And if you actually look at what Freemasons do in the world, I mean, they raise millions of dollars for charities primarily aimed at children, the Scottish Rite Hospitals. They treat children who are they have burn units that they establish, and they treat thousands and thousands of children completely free of charge. And that's a big part of what they do and what their orientation is charitable work. Secondly, they also are custodians of an ancient body of technical knowledge about esoteric building and symbolism. They have a very rich corpus of symbolism that's been handed down literally for centuries. And again, you have to go back to this idea that, during periods of history where you had authoritarian institutions that had the Inquisition at their disposal, and anybody who deviated from the party line, even in the slightest, could be accused of heresy and subject to all of the tortures and the death sentences and so forth. So the secrecy was a big part of the historic. You have to understand it within the historical context of the times. Also, it's based upon essentially a retelling of the universal myth that's at the basis of so many religions. The idea of the prominence of a human to almost a divine state, and then the fall of that individual, whether through a sacrifice or through a murder. We see the death of Orpheus, we see the death of Attis, we see the death of Jesus, and the death of Hiram Abiff in the Masonic allegory. But it's very much like, when one goes into the craft, what you are doing is participating in a mystery drama. And I kind of look at it, it's like this: if you were going to go see an intricately plotted movie with twists at the end, you would not want somebody to necessarily tell you the outcome of the movie to destroy your emotional experience of that movie. And so there's a level of secrecy that's involved that also has to do with essentially going in and being emotionally open to the experience of the mystery play.
Well, I think people need to keep an open and critical mind. But how about this? The Skull and Bones, are you familiar with them? Yeah,
and they're not, there may have been some Skull and Bones members that became Masons.
No. I'm not saying that they're connected to the Masons, but I'm saying that I'm using this as an example of, these elements of perversion and malevolent behaviors that should be looked at and we should be wary of. So I can certainly see how compartmentalized, secret societies, if you will, of evil are something to be wary of.
Yeah, and again, I don't really know much about Skull and Bones other than it seems to be intrinsic to Yale University, and a lot of the Yale grads have come up through that, Northeastern establishment.
Randall, I hate to cut this off. This is getting good, but we got to take a quick break, and then we'll come right back. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right.
All right, Randall, I don't want to get into too much deeper into the Freemason thing because I think it's a distraction and takes us away from the really interesting stuff that you have to offer that we should look at, the conversation about time, sacred geometry, so on and so forth. But I think a lot of our listeners love it or hate it, unfortunately use that as a strike against you. And I hate to see people generalize. I hate to see people just say, well, Freemasons, they're all bad, or Jews, they're all bad, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, I do know of elements of pedophilia within Freemasonry. I know of it firsthand. I do know of elements of criminality amongst Freemasonry, the good old boy network sort of thing, where people are given a pat on the back and exempted from the law and so on and so forth. So there is that element. But then on the other hand, I see your point. And I know Freemasons. I know a lot of Freemasons that are good people that are interested in the esoteric discovery of knowledge.
Well, you have to bear in mind, again, that there's roughly 5 million Freemasons in America today. And you take a cross-section of 5 million people, you're going to find some bad eggs. But you've got to be able to separate the Freemasonry, the craft, from an individual that happens to be in it. I mean, there's, again, using the analogy, we could probably dig up lots of dirt on plenty of Southern Baptists that have committed crimes, pedophilia and everything like that. Is that now an accurate or true reflection on the belief system or on Baptists as a whole? That would be my question. I guess the final thing I would say about it is that Freemasonry has a very broad-minded and tolerant philosophy. The only prerequisite philosophically is that one accept the idea of a supreme creator, because Freemasonry is based upon the principle that the universe is a work of architecture, and therefore God is envisioned as a great architect. And without some kind of belief in a supreme creator, the whole body of information and symbolism and ritualism and so forth would be meaningless. Because of that broad-mindedness and that tolerance of many different religious views, fundamentalists don't like it. And fundamentalists, I have noticed, have been the ones who are most stringent in their attacks upon it. Because, you may go into a Masonic lodge and find a New Testament, a Torah, and a Quran all placed upon the altar.
Yeah, what about Manly P. Hall's book, though? Morals and Dogma.
Had on an altar, but yeah, that's the point.
Well, what about that book, though? I mean, that is a major eyesore as far as Freemasonry is concerned, in my opinion. In many interpretations of it, it talks about worshiping Jabbalon and essentially Lucifer and so on and so forth.
Well, all of these things have to be taken in context. First of all, understand that, what became the Christian devil was, basically earlier pagan gods, that were just recast. And there's a lot of, to me, there's a lot of superstition in religion, particularly fundamentalist religion. Taking literally things like the devil, Lucifer. But think about this, even the Latin phrase for Lucifer literally translates as light bringer. Now, what does that mean? Why would we instinctively associate the concept of bringing light with the devil? this is more of a Promethean kind of a concept, somebody who's bringing benefits to mankind. If you look at read carefully the stories, the creation stories in Genesis, you realize that the serpent maybe was not necessarily the one who was misleading, in the garden. And you find out, if you take that cursory reading and you look at it and you go, wait a second, the serpent seems to be the one who was telling them that, they wouldn't die if they ate of the tree of knowledge. And of course they did eat of the tree of knowledge and they didn't die. And it was a serpent that said, if you eat of the tree of knowledge, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like the gods. And then of course they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and as the Bible says itself, their eyes were opened. Now, as it turns out, there's a whole other alternate tradition of early Christianity called Gnosticism that basically turned conventional Christian belief totally on its head. Now, I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. I'm just saying that there was a completely alternative, different belief, which was the serpent was a symbol of knowledge and wisdom, as it was frequently throughout many religious traditions of the world. And when it was taken over, when a lot of the pagan traditions were taken over by authoritarian Christianity, the connections with paganism had to be suppressed. And many of the gods of the old religion essentially become the devils of the new authoritarian religion. And that's exactly what we see happening in the transformation from paganism into Christianity. And if you look at a study of the origins of Christianity, its pagan roots are undeniable. And so when we talk about devils and this and that, we have to look at it in the broad context of, early belief systems and the history of the times and so forth. So, the fact that so much of that ancient symbolism, yes, there is pagan symbolism in Freemasonry, no doubt. There's elements of Greek mythology in Freemasonry. Do we not expose ourselves to Greek mythology, the stories of Zeus and Hera and those and Dionysus and Demeter and so forth and Artemis, because we're afraid that we're going to be exposing ourselves to teachings of the devil? Or do we look at it as scholars, recognizing that there are early belief systems that may have had validity in their historical context of the times?
I think context is very important, and oftentimes people miss out on that context, so I'm glad you're shedding light to that. But I also see that you're a supporter of Ron Paul and a libertarian. Is there a connection between the ideals of the Founding Fathers, Freemasonry, and libertarianism, in your opinion? And what connections is there between the French and American revolutionaries with the Freemasonry tradition?
Well, there certainly does seem to be historical links. Now, my impression of Freemasonry is that it highly values the individual. And many of the ideals of the early republic and, the ideas of democracy and so forth, arose out of the early guild system where essentially, one member had a vote and you would vote for those who were in charge of you. Although the early system, you had to qualify. The leaders of the early craft weren't just picked willy-nilly out of the membership. There was essentially a pool of highly qualified individuals that had proved their worth, and that was the ranks. But in the lodges today, they still essentially vote in a very democratic system, as they did 700 and 800 years ago. So I would certainly be willing to believe that the early Founding Fathers, many of whom were Masons, but not maybe as many as a lot of people think. I've heard people say all of the Founding Fathers were Freemasons. That is not true. Maybe a third of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, for example,
they were deists, right?
Yes, I think most of them could be considered deists. But, certainly they weren't all Freemasons.
And what about Ron Paul? Is he a Freemason?
Not that I know of. Okay. I've never heard that Ron Paul is a Freemason.
People are down on Ron, and especially his son Rand. You want to weigh in on that possibly?
It's difficult to say. It's politics. It could be that there's a quid pro quo going on there. That Romney is, sort of obviously he's going to be the Republican nominee, I think, at this point. And, will Romney make some concessions towards the freedom lovers, the constitutional upholders of this country if some of us agree to support him? I don't know. I really don't know. I've gotten a little frustrated over that myself, the whole treatment of Ron Paul and the whole electoral process.
Yeah, people are talking about it. It's a really hot story. I hate to cut you off, but we're coming up to another quick break here, and then we'll be back. When we come back, I want to start getting into this discussion about time, which we got into briefly in the last show. And we'll talk about that and so much more with our special guest, Randall Carlson, tonight. Don't go anywhere. His website, sacredgeometry.com. I think I got it right. No, sacredgeometryinternational.com. Yeah, there we go. We'll be right back. All right, I'm going to tease the time segment. I'm going to let it wait here for a little bit. I'm going to give it some more time. No pun intended.
Okay.
Let's talk about your catastrophic views. It says here you are a catastrophist, or no, how do I say that? Let me try that one more.
Catastrophist.
Catastrophist. I have a hard time with that word for some reason, Randall. I don't know why.
There's a few words that I have a hard time with myself every once in a while.
Those words I'm like, sound it out, Bob. Sound it out.
Catastrophist.
All right, thank you. A little phonics here on Bob Tuskin.
Yeah.
All right, you're a catastrophist. Now I can say it fine. What is catastrophism, and how does it relate to sacred geometry?
Well, it gets into the question of time. That's because catastrophism is the doctrine that the uniform pace of change that we ordinarily experience day to day, year to year, decade to decade is occasionally or even frequently punctuated by events of a different order. And it was originally the original concept of earth change at the founding days of geology in the 1700s, probably the first half of the 1800s, even up until the close of the 19th century. And then it was replaced by doctrines of uniformity and gradualism that essentially maintained that the pace of change as we see at present is sufficient if given enough time to explain all geological change or earth change since the earth began. And that became pretty much the dominant dogma of the 20th century, the dogma of uniformity or gradualism, with some objectors to that all along, but certainly considered outside the mainstream. Although in the last, say, 25 or 30 years of the 20th century, catastrophism began to see a revival with the discovery of very convincing evidence that, yes, the normal placid pace of change has indeed been interrupted from time to time by what we might want to call discontinuous or nonlinear events, and that sometimes these events are of global scale, and what they do is affect essentially a global reorganization of ocean, atmosphere, biological systems, and so forth, so that when the dust settles, there's essentially a new order of things in place. And my interest in it comes, and I guess you would say the connection perhaps with sacred geometry, is that in a lot of the ancient models, the numbers that are used to measure the geometric principles in space also turn out to be the same numbers that measure cyclical change according to the ancient models.
Interesting. Now, let me just ask real quick. I was talking to Cameron about this before the show today, and he was telling me that the number of seconds in a year, a day, I forgot which one, is the same number as the circumference of the sun.
Well, not exactly. What you have is a series of numbers. Essentially, they are linked. They're decanary numbers. They're numbers that are linked by a sequence of digits. So, for example, the diameter of the sun is usually given in the older texts. It's usually given as 864,000 miles. If you reduce that by a factor of 10, you have the number of seconds in a day, which is 86,400. What's interesting, though, is that when you look at, ancient traditions, we find that, For example, in the Vedas, there is a unit of time called the Dwapara Yuga. I don't know if you're familiar with the Vedic traditions. They were very much concerned with the passage of time and the idea of cyclical time. And they conceived of these great cyclical spans of time called yugas. And essentially it was a fourfold system of yugas. And then there was the second one in the system is called a Dwapara Yuga, and it was 864,000 years. So there's kind of this repetition of these sequences of decimals, 8.64, 864, 100, 86,400, 864,000, that we find measuring elements of time and space. And the system can only be appreciated when you realize how extensive it actually is. For example, the next Yuga after the Dwapara is the Treta Yuga, which was generally considered to be 1,296,000 years. Well, if we take any circle and draw a circle, and you know that circles are all divided into degrees, of which there are 360 in every circle, right? And then we see that each degree is divided into minutes, and that comes from the idea that each degree is divided into a minute part. Therefore, it's a minute. And then each minute is divided into a second order of minuteness. So in the measurement of space in terms of a circle, we have degrees, minutes, and seconds, analogous to the measurement of time, and think of the circular clock face with hours, minutes, and seconds. We even use the same terminology, and they essentially bear the same relation to each other. But if you take a circle composed of 360 degrees, each of those degrees is 60 minutes, 60 arc minutes. Each of those minutes of arc is 60 seconds of arc. Each circle has a total of 1,296,000 seconds of arc, comprising its total circumference. Now, if you take that and think of that as a model of time, being cyclical time, each arc second would then correspond to the passage of 1 year within the Vedic model of the Treta Yuga. So
interesting.
These kinds of correlations are legion throughout the whole system.
Yeah, I'm a little confused, though, because I always thought that, the reason why there was 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and so on and so forth, was practically arbitrary. I never understood the real reasoning behind the measurements, the units. And if I really think about it, what we may call 60 minutes in one language, somebody else could call something else in a different language and have a different understanding of it in a sense. I don't know. I've never been very good at math, to be honest.
Well, but most people do generally think it's arbitrary. I think the more prosaic explanation would be the reason we would divide a circle into 360 degrees is that the number of 360 has a high number of factors to it. So, in other words, what that means is if you had a circle of 360 degrees, and it would give you the maximum potential number of different sized pie slices, where you could have a whole number of pie slices where they're all the same size. So if you think of the number 360 and you start thinking of the factors that would go into it with nothing left over, it's a high number. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is not, but 8, 9, 10, 11 is not, but 12. And so on. All of these numbers are factors of 360. So, it's a number that you would probably, anybody who knew something about geometry would probably, rediscover that number as being an ideal number for, dividing up a circle, and so forth. But there seems to be another level, because if you actually read in the history of geometry, the origin of as it's called, the sexagesimal division of the circle's circumference is generally attributed to the Babylonians. The Babylonians had a sacred calendar, as did many of the other ancient cultures or other cultures of the ancient world, an idealized calendar in which the year was 360 days. And so what they were attempting to do was to correlate time and space by linking the circle to the geometric circle drawn on the ground with the circle of the year, and so that you would have 1 day corresponding to 1 degree. Now, of course, our year is not 360 days long; it's 365 and a quarter. But ancient beliefs suggested that there was this idealized concept of the year. Some traditions had the belief that the year was actually once 360 days long. Some catastrophe came along, and post-catastrophe, the year was lengthened by 5 1/4 days. The Egyptians, in their calendar, sacred calendar of 360 days, they actually extended it by 5 days, which was 1/4 day off, and they attributed those 5 days that were outside of the system being the birthdays of the Egyptian pantheon of gods. Many different cultures had their ways of linking their concept of idealized sacred time with actual time. In the way I kind of look at it is like this: if you, as a builder, I know that if I'm given a set of architectural blueprints, you're looking at essentially the idealized structure. Now you go out, and depending on the level of craftsmanship and how much time has elapsed since the building was constructed, there's going to be a deviation between the idealized structure in the blueprints and the actual real-world structure as it exists in the vagaries of, climate and weather and time and the abilities of the craftsman and so forth. And it will deviate somewhat.
Interesting.
Very similar to the ancient concept is that there's this idealized model of the universe, both in space and time. But the actual model, that's the real world model, different from the archetypal model.
All right, we got to take a quick break here. Sorry about that, Randall. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. All right, it's the final segment for this hour with Randall Carlson. SacredGeometryInternational.com is the website. It's got a wealth of information and some videos that they've been putting out on YouTube, as well as a DVD titled Cosmic Patterns and Cycles of Catastrophe. You should definitely check it out. We're getting into catastrophe, time, and so on and so forth. Now, my buddy Cameron, who helped set this up, he was telling me I messed it all up, Randall. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, which is very much probably the case. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. That's why I do the show, so I can learn. He's saying that I was supposed to say that it was, let me try to make sure I read this correctly this time. It was seconds in a day, 86,400 seconds per day. The diameter of the sun is 864,000 miles. Interesting.
Yeah. That's correct. There we go.
All right. So now we got that.
All right. We've clarified that matter, haven't we?
We certainly have. Let's continue taking a look at some of this, catastrophe. We were looking at the Vedas. And in the Vedas, there's all sorts of crazy stuff. A lot of people point to the Vedas and they talk about the flying saucers, which I always found really fascinating because, you wonder, is time cyclical? Is that the word?
Cyclical, yeah.
Cyclical, okay. Thank you.
Well, that was, I think, more akin to the ancient concept that, time was cyclical, that there would be events, recurring events. I mean, obviously, just in our own experience of life, we see cyclical time. The day, the what we call the diurnal cycle, is the turning of one time of the Earth on its axis. And then we see the annual cycle, which is the journey around the sun. And of course, what we see is a repetition throughout that. We see the unfolding sequence of the seasons. But what we're seeing is not an exact replication from year to year. What we're seeing is variations on a theme, so that the first day of frost this year may not be the same as the first day of frost last year. The average temperature and the specific temperature on a day-to-day basis may not be the same from year to year. It's not. Yet, obviously, we see that in the normal sequence of things, there's a cyclical change. Summer follows spring, fall follows summer, and winter follows autumn. So, obviously, there is this cyclical component. In ancient cosmological concepts, it was recognized that there were greater cycles encompassing these smaller, if we want to call them human scale cycles. And the term that has generally been used to describe that greater cycle is the great year. And in the works of various scholars such as Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschamps, who wrote an important book called Hamlet's Mill, published back in 1969, in which they make the contention that the archaic model of time was based upon a recognition of the precessional cycle of the Earth's axis, which is the thing that, everybody knows about, the ages. We talk about the age of Aquarius and the age of Pisces and so forth. Everybody's heard that. We can all, those of us who are a little older remember, of course, the big hit song in the 1960s.
Age of Aquarius. And are we not going into the age of Aquarius right now? Isn't that the supposed epoch in time?
Well, there's the New Age version of that, and then there's the real astronomy. And what it comes down to is that the Earth's axis swings around in a conical fashion, almost like a top spinning. And so that it's like right now the North Pole of the Earth's axis points almost directly to the star Polaris, which is our North Star. But due to this motion of the Earth's axis, Polaris will not remain the pole star for more than half a millennium or so, in which case the Earth's North Polar axis will not be pointing to it anymore. 13,000 years ago, the pole star was Vega. Now, as Earth's axis is moving, likewise, Earth's equator is moving. And because of the fact that Earth's equator is moving, the date at which the sun crosses the Earth's equator, which is the date that gives us the two equinoxes, spring equinox and autumn equinox, that's moving as well. That causes the date of both the equinoxes and the solstices to constantly be shifting through time. And in the ancient or archaic models of time, the Earth was considered to have been reborn on spring equinox. And the position of the sun at the moment that day and night are of exact equal duration marks the spring equinox. And there's a position in the sky that the sun occupies. There's nothing there, but it's merely a position in the plane of the ecliptic, which is defined as the Earth's orbit around the sun. That position is moving or precessing from the east towards the west at 50 arc seconds per year. Okay, what that means is it is slowly drifting through the sky against the backdrop of fixed stars. And for roughly the last 2,000 years, if you could go out at the moment of spring equinox and turn the sun off momentarily and look at what constellation of stars would be beyond it or behind it, it was the constellation of Pisces, the fish. For roughly 2,000 years before that, it was Aries. For roughly 2,000 years before that, it was Taurus. What's going to happen now is that vernal equinox is actually still within the present day configuration of Pisces. And, we don't know that the present day configuration of Pisces is exactly what it was to the ancient world, but what we see is that according to our present configuration of the constellations, the vernal point, the spring equinox point, will not actually enter into the star field comprising Aquarius for about another 400 or 500 years yet. So, when you talk about the age of Aquarius, in the vague New Age sense, it might mean one thing, but in the precise astronomical sense, I'd say we're not there yet. We've still got some centuries to go yet before the sun is actually superimposed upon the star field of Aquarius during the time of spring. But certainly over the next roughly 2,000 years, the sun at the moment of spring equinox will be traversing those stars. And over a period of on average, it's about 2,160 years. And given that there are 12 signs in the zodiac, you go 12 times 2,160, and you come up with about 26,000 years for the whole cycle. That is what the ancients generally thought of as the great year, which was the next step up in terms of the cyclical reckoning of time. And they believed that there was a correlation. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. I referred earlier to the idea of a 360-day calendar. And for many years, I mean, it's older now because we're constantly improving lifespan.
Right.
For a long time, as I was growing up when I was younger, generally most textbooks said average human lifespan globally, or at least in the advanced countries, is about 72 years. And I think now globally that is about the average lifespan of 72 years. Well, you can do a quick calculation if you want, and it works out like this. If you were to base this upon the idealized calendar of 360 years, then 72 years would be exactly 25,920 days.
Holy smokes. Hold that thought for just a second. I'll let you finish that thought. Just give me one moment here.
Got it. It's yours.
Welcome to the Bob Tuskin Radio Show with your host, Bob Tuskin.
Well, I guess for whatever reason you haven't satisfied the listeners out there, Randall, that want to condemn you for being a Freemason. So at some point towards the end of the hour, let's open up the phone lines and let them confront you if they want to.
Sure.
You know, because
what seems to be the
oh, geez, I could read you some of these questions here, but I want to finish our thoughts on this other stuff before we get back into that. But
okay.
I'll go ahead and put the invitation on the table so that we can have people address it, because I do think it's good to have the discussion. You know, I do think that we should welcome it, and as long as it's civil and respectful and we look at the information at hand, I'm all for it. So we'll do that towards the end of this hour at 866-841-1065. Tell me about this DVD you have. Cameron has been raving about it. I have yet to check it out. It's called Cosmic Patterns and Cycles, which we were just talking about, of Catastrophe.
Well, yeah. So what it does is it's a much more elaborate development of the things we were just talking about. You know, using models and graphics and animations and so forth to help people get the picture. You know, precession of the equinoxes, we're talking about that. It's a little bit difficult to describe, you know, verbally, like over the phone here. It's much easier to grasp when you can see images and animations and so forth. When you can see the various numbers that we're talking about here actually tabulated in some kind of a coherent manner. So that's essentially what it's going to be about. And then it's going to go into some of the possible manifestations of some of these ideas in terms of real-world change. You know, which may be the thing we're going to be about to talk about, which gets us back to the idea of catastrophism, is because in the ancient models, we find that these cycles of time are punctuated by these, what I refer to as discontinuous or nonlinear events, catastrophes, if you will, and that there seems to be a rhythm to the catastrophes in some of the models. If we look at the Zoroastrian model, the Persian model, for example, it's very clear on the idea that that these things were cyclical in nature. And so what I'm interested in is seeing if there's a correlation between what modern science has to say about the matter and what ancient science had to say about the matter. If I can just do a very short quote here from The World Year of the Persians, which appeared way back in 1963 in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, by Kennedy and van der Waarden. The notion of cyclically recurrent cosmic disasters, a catastrophe by flood alternating with one by fire, has been traced from ancient Babylonia and Iran through Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy and thence into the medieval world. These catastrophes were supposed to return periodically when the planets came together in certain signs of the zodiac. In the Persian system, we still find the deluge connected with a conjunction of the planets. So that's just kind of a sample of, what I could literally give you dozens of quotes referring to various archaic traditions regarding the notion of a cyclically recurrent system of disasters that sweep away the old order of things and replace it with a new order of ages, if you will.
Yeah, you mentioned that part of the world, Mesopotamia, what was called the cradle of civilization. And it's funny that we're going into all these wars there. And some of the first things that took place when we invaded Iraq were some of the sacred, symbols being... We'll talk about that when we come back on the other side of this quick break. Folks, welcome back to the Bob Tuskin Show. Our special guest tonight is Randall Carlson, and we're talking about a number of different things. I guess there is a Charlie Sheen show on tonight. I had no idea. But don't worry, this is archived, so if you want to go and watch the Charlie Sheen show, Trainwreck, whatever that may be, feel free. Our feelings
that
won't
may
be
be
hurt.
Appropriate in light of our discussion on catastrophism.
I love it. Oh, man, we couldn't have set that one up better for you. Where would you like to pick it up with our version of Catastrophe?
Well, I guess let's get back to this idea of a cyclical destruction that we were kind of talking about before the break. This idea that this belief in epochs of nature. Quoting one mythologist, Daniel G. Brenton, who wrote a very interesting work called Myths of the New World back in 1868. He refers to the cycles of the Stoics and the great days of Brahm, which of course was a Hindu concept. Long periods of time rounded off by sweeping destructions, the cataclysms and ekparouses of the universe. Now, the two terms cataclysm and ekparousis. Cataclysm originally referred to a watery destruction of the world, and ekparousis originally referred to as a fiery destruction of the world, because this was kind of the simplified model, which was that the earth was alternately destroyed by flood and fire. And we kind of find that reflected in the biblical tradition, because we, of course, find Noah's flood destroying the world in Genesis, and then we find in the Apocalypsis, or the Revelation of St. John, descriptions of the world being destroyed by fire. Now, of course, science has never really considered those to be other than myths or religious superstitions. That the most credence that they were, for example, willing to give to Noah's flood was that it was probably a local flood in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. There's been some pretty extraordinary floods there, actually, in that region of the world.
Sure.
But certainly not anything that was global in nature. Yet what we've just found out is that, in the last few decades, evidence is emerging that there have been floods repeatedly around the planet, various places, that really could only be described as biblical in scale, not in the simplified model of the water uniformly rising to cover every mountaintop around the entire world, but certainly floods that would have had the capability of wiping out entire civilizations, that would have essentially destroyed everything to the extent that a survivor would think that the entire world had been destroyed in the aftermath. And there's a whole branch of geology now that's called paleohydrology, which essentially addresses itself to these ancient floods, which have occurred on a scale far beyond anything that was even imagined a few decades ago. Throughout the course of the 20th century, there was a few researchers that were pretty much branded as heretics and crackpots, because they were looking at evidence that they were describing as being proof that these tremendous floods had happened. One of them by name was J. Harlan Bretz, probably one of the more well-known, who was looking at flood evidence out in the Pacific Northwest. And the floods he was describing were so far beyond anything that was recognized by mainstream geology at the time that the geologists just automatically labeled him a crackpot and refused to even go look at the evidence in the field that he had been documenting for decades. When they finally went out and started looking at it, they said, you know what, Bretz was right. There are these gigantic floods whose peak discharges can only be measured in hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second. Now, that's a number that would be pretty much inconceivable to most people. What would that even mean? Well, when you consider that the Mississippi River has maybe a couple of 100,000 cubic feet per second, and in its greatest historical floods, for example, in '93, which until Katrina was the most expensive natural disaster in American history, the Great Mississippi Flood of '93 peaked out at just over 1 million cubic feet per second, and some of the floods that this J. Holland Bretts were looking at could only be measured in hundreds of millions, even some cases approaching 1,000 or 1 billion cubic feet per second, which would be the equivalent of 1,000 Mississippi rivers at the largest historical measured floods. And mainstream geology was not willing to accept that. It took them almost half a century before it became mainstream. And what has happened since then is that with the recognition of the kind of geomorphic consequences of floods on that scale, it's made it possible to recognize that similar floods have happened all over the planet at various times. Floods that clearly could be, wipe out entire cities.
Well, let me ask you this.
Actually erase them from the planet.
Right. Let me ask you this, though. I'm getting word from one of our friends here that he thinks that the flood was a great and a great opportunity, rather, for the new power elite to assert control over a traumatized human species. He goes on to talk about Persia and Samaria, as well as Egypt, which have been illuminators in the Illuminati's to schools. I'm reading this as he's writing it. But I think that's an interesting question. What about that? Was the flood used as an opportunity for the power elite to assert control?
Well, the scale of floods that I'm talking about didn't leave a power elite. Essentially, it erased the entire basis of civilization. Whatever means that the power elite would have had to control the masses pretty much didn't exist anymore. Now, in lesser, I think he has a point, though, that in a lesser cataclysm where you would have, let's take Katrina, for example. Here you had the chaos of a natural disaster exacerbated by actions or inactions of the government. There you had the failure of levees, which exaggerated the effects of the flood surge, of the hurricane surge, and then you had the aftermath of it, where they were attempting to control the outcome, which was essentially herding people as if they were cattle into the places, into the stadiums, then preventing outside sources from coming in and bringing relief and so forth. So we really, confiscating people's weapons, confiscating people's guns. Yeah, we certainly can see in a catastrophe of that scale that those in power used the opportunity to seize control. Now, in the scale of the floods that I'm talking about, you got to understand that we're talking about the entire basis of civilization being undermined. And the mechanism, I would have a difficult time seeing what mechanisms of control the quote-unquote elites would be able to employ to control the masses when, perhaps the human population in these regions had essentially been decimated by 90% or more. Basically, if we give any credence to the myths, what we find consistently is that you have survivors struggling to survive. You have small bands of survivors struggling to survive. That seems to be pretty much the universal tradition, and we can see that we see that from the Mayan traditions. We see that in American Indian traditions. We see that in Chinese traditions. Of course, the Babylonian traditions. That what comes out of it is only a small group of survivors.
Yeah, maybe that group is the new elite, perhaps. All right, hold that thought. Stand by. We got to take another quick break, and then we'll be back.
All right.
Okay, so just to recap, we're talking about the floods here, the various floods throughout history. And through studying these floods, Randall, where are we going with this?
Well, it gets us back to this idea that geology is confirming essentially what archaic traditions have maintained all along, that catastrophes are very real. Which leads us to the next question in my mind, which is that, many of these traditions about ancient catastrophes, if they don't overtly state it, they imply that catastrophes are cyclical in nature. This is kind of only implicit within the biblical tradition, but it's interesting that when you read the account of the Yahwistic creation of Adam and Eve, it's basically they're given the junction to the command to replenish the earth and subdue it, to not to plenish the earth, to replenish the earth, which seems to be a sort of a consistent idea amongst a lot of the other traditions where it's more overtly stated that the survivors of the flood are given the or the destruction in whatever form it takes are given the task of replenishing the earth. So there's sort of the implicit idea that there may have been a previous destruction, which then of course is followed by the Noahite flood. And then the end of the Bible, of course, ends with the apocalypse, which describes fiery destruction, the stars falling from heaven, and a great conflagration upon the earth.
Yeah, but the Bible, I mean, a lot of people would argue that that's not the greatest source. As we mentioned, it was heavily co-opted and changed from the Gnostic teachings and so on. So.
Oh yeah, but interestingly, when you access the Gnostic traditions, they're abundant the apocalyptic literature was vast. What we've got in the Bible is only one example of it. But yeah, there were many examples of apocalyptic literature that goes into great detail describing these destructions of the earth.
In the Gnostic teachings, yeah. That's interesting. Well, Randall, I guess the question is, are you trying to say that we're headed to some sort of catastrophe, or are we going to see that in our lifetimes?
I'm saying that.
Prediction?
No, I'm not necessarily saying when. I'm not saying in our lifetime. What I'm saying though is that clearly the geological record suggests that catastrophes of various kinds have been numerous through the history of the Earth on all time scales. And a catastrophe, for example, that would cause a mass extinction is one scale. Where most scientifically literate people today are knowledgeable about the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction, probably the most famous one, now attributed to an asteroid causing the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, right? Well, that's a mass extinction event, and a mass extinction event, there have been at least 5 considered great mass extinction events in the history of the Earth, and innumerable lesser ones. The most recent mass extinction event would be at the termination of what is known as the Pleistocene epoch and the inauguration of the current geological epoch that we're in, called the Holocene. And this was an extinction event that occurred roughly between 11 and 13,000 years ago, when all of the mega mammals, the great woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant ground sloths, all of these great creatures that inhabited the Ice Age world disappeared in a geological eye blink. That is a mass extinction event. A mass extinction event is definitely going to be related to habitat loss. Habitat loss is going to be related to some kind of disruption in the normal, orderly pace of nature, whatever the source of that. In the case of the dinosaur extinction, it was at least one asteroid. I mean, I think the evidence is suggesting now that there was a clustered bombardment around that particular geological boundary. New evidence is emerging that there may have been a bombardment only 12,000 years ago that terminated the woolly mammoths. Now, that's a very controversial idea at present, but it's a very interesting one, and I am inclined to believe that when the dust settles, that there will be merit to that idea. Now, on the other hand, a mass extinction event could literally cause the extinction of the human species. But there are many scales of natural events that could be considered catastrophic that would fall far below a mass extinction event, yet could cause the complete disruption of modern civilization. We see these events even within the last few thousand years. The events that inaugurated the Dark Ages appear, there's some evidence now that there may have been an impact, or at least several impacts, into the world's oceans around between 536 and 540 AD, causing a dust pall to encircle the globe. And
let me take it a step further here, Randall, if I may, and this thought just occurred to me. I remember learning that the sun only has so much time before it blows up. Is that about right?
Yeah, but we're looking at long spans of time there.
Well,
we're not looking at anything that would be of concern to us in the immediate
regardless,
future.
the point is, ultimately, whether it's eons from now or not, ultimately, it's all going to end in an ultimate catastrophic event, which is the destruction of our star.
Yeah, and I'm hoping by that time that maybe we've evolved to the point where we.
How many cycles would we have to go through before that happens? Wow.
Yeah, we're getting into sort of a cosmological domain that I've kind of deliberately stayed away from because I've tried to keep it a little closer to home, like
I know,
what
but
could affect
these
us in the
questions,
next.
how the universe goes on to infinity.
Oh yeah,
you see these fractals and these cycles, and it's
yeah,
mind-boggling stuff. It's good stuff.
But as to it's inevitable that we've got catastrophes in our future. There's no question. But ever since I recall being in high school back in the 60s, I could probably cite a dozen times, when somebody stood up and declared such and such a date was going to be the end of the world, and then of course it doesn't happen. But to me, it's kind of like the story of the boy who cried wolf. He made it up enough times until nobody believed it anymore. But in the end, the real wolf finally showed up and ate the sheep. And sooner or later, there will be a real catastrophe upon us, whether it's endogenic coming from within the earth or exogenic coming from outside the earth. Yes, something will trigger because it's part of the inherent process. Now, the question is will we have evolved as a society where we are able to adapt to those kinds of sweeping changes, or to prevent them altogether, thereby breaking the cycle, if you will. And I kind of like that idea, the idea that we could, get our act together to the point where, we could actually begin to deal with some of this. And here's something that's kind of ironic in mentioning the idea of an asteroid impact, which is also an idea now that 50 years ago nobody looked at that as being a factor in the geological history of the Earth, much less the social history of humankind. Yet we now realize that that impacts on the Earth have happened far more frequently than anybody had ever even imagined, even a generation ago. And if you doubt that, just go out with a high-powered pair of binoculars and take a good look at the surface of the moon and realize that we're probably 80 times more susceptible to impact from things from space than the moon is. The idea of space as an empty place where nothing happens, that's obsolete. We now realize that the cosmic domain in which our planet is going through its great evolution is inhabited by a whole diversity of cosmic creatures, and that we encounter those creatures from time to time with catastrophic consequences.
Interesting.
Now, what's interesting is that at this point, doing something about we couldn't do anything about a hurricane, we couldn't do anything about a large volcanic eruption, we can't do anything about earthquakes, but the one disaster, the cosmic disaster that exceeds them all in its severity and could actually trigger all of those things is the one thing that we potentially actually could do something about, which I find interesting, which kind of implies to me that maybe there is, something that we should be looking at long term, is that creating a civilization that could deal with the threats of asteroid and comet.
Interesting. All right, Randall, we're coming up to our final segment with you tonight, and we're going to take calls. So call in 866-841-1065.
This is the Oracle Broadcasting Radio Network. Visit us online at oraclebroadcasting.com.
It's the final segment we have with Randall Carlson. If you'd like to stay in touch with him, you can find him at his website, sacredgeometryinternational.com. And during the break, we were getting into some very profound subjects. Here's your opportunity, though, folks. 866-841-1065. We are welcoming your phone calls. If you want to revisit the Freemason stuff, feel free to call in. 866-841-1065. Get out your crayon, write that number down, and we'll take the calls with Randall Carlson. 866-841-1065. Now, Randall, in closing tonight, where would you like to go?
I'm wide open. I'm on the roll with the catastrophism thing, but
yeah, we might as well end it off with a bang.
There we go. Sure.
So we could protect ourselves from an asteroid.
We certainly could.
But and we could also protect ourselves. Let me take it a step further here, from some sort of solar flare. We could protect our electrical grid, that is. But no, we want to spend billions of dollars on the military-industrial complex and the warmongers, and we want to waste all these resources for iPods and wasteless, well, maybe not iPods, but, worthless stuff. The reality of the situation is, if we were to apply those resources to protect ourselves, we would really be a lot safer. But we don't do that.
No, we don't. But, ironically, and this is something I have to admit, is that, a lot of the technologies developed, Star Wars technologies being a case in point, may have applications if it came down to developing a planetary defense system. And to me, it's regrettable that perhaps it requires that kind of a context for the emergence of those technologies. But of course, when those ideas were first being proposed and the research being done, the idea of global catastrophe was only just getting off the ground. And, we know a lot more about the potential for that now.
I can see it now, Randall. We need to come together for this new world order to fight against a comet or asteroid that's going to kill us all on the planet. So we need to put our differences aside and join together for the new world order.
Well, sort of, yeah, I kind of agree with that in a sense.
You do? Okay.
Yeah, I do. I mean, we're here's the thing. It may not kill us all, but, it wouldn't take much of a disaster. Think about this. I mean, even a small impact of something from space could disrupt global agriculture for up to several years. And given that even advanced industrial countries usually only have no more than about 6 months of food supplies in reserve, it wouldn't be long before people would be starving to death with the collapse of agriculture. And, I brought up the example of the Dark Ages, which we now know was literally true. I mean, dendrochronology studies of tree rings show that in the Northern Hemisphere for almost a decade, literally forest growth almost came to a complete halt between about 536 and 544 AD. And local chronicles of the time describe, literally months at a time without people seeing the sun. And it's possible that we were subject to a small cosmic volley at the time, which caused the planet to become enshrouded with dust, which caused the collapse of agriculture, which then caused famine, and with people starving and their weakened immune system, it created the opportunity for the great outbreak of the Justinian plague, which wiped out millions of people. So, I mean, there's a whole concatenation of events that could follow from an incursion of even a small object from space. And, of course, if anybody's paying attention, if you follow the astronomical news, you know that every year there are multiple near misses, things shooting by us in space all the time, far more frequently, than people had imagined 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. At the same time, we're discovering, you probably recall the Shoemaker-Levy 9 event of 1994, right? Mm-hmm. When we literally witnessed a comet being undergoing a disintegration as it passed through the strong gravity field of Jupiter, and we witnessed actually one comet nucleus becoming 21 individual comet nuclei. We're also finding evidence from all of the silicate planets in the inner solar system that they have been subject to multiple bombardment episodes similar to Shoemaker-Levy 9. And I mentioned earlier that there's evidence emerging that perhaps a similar type of event terminated the last ice age and may have been responsible for triggering some of the flood legends, because we know that around 13 to 14,000 years, and for the 10,000 years previous to that, the planet was in the grip of a deep ice age, and there was as much as 5 to 7 million cubic miles of ocean water had been extracted out of the oceans and was locked up in the continents in the form of glacial ice.
Sure.
And that in just a few thousand years, which is a geological eye blink, that ice melted and was returned to the oceans. That caused the ocean levels to rise from their late glacial maximum low to its present level, 400 feet. Now think about coastal communities during that epoch when sea level is rising sometimes several feet a year. And
I'm sure they would be
going to wipe out. Yeah.
I'm sure they're underwater by now. It's interesting, though. Let me ask you this, because we're running low on time. What about the whole Nibiru Planet X thing? Are you aware of those things?
That's an interesting idea, but there's very little actual hard evidence that I've seen for that idea. There's some interesting conjectural evidence, and I don't rule it out that there's a companion to the sun in terms of could be either a dark star or another planet, but the real evidence for it is very negligible. Got to keep an open mind about these things, but that's primarily based ultimately on Zecharia Sitchin's reading of Babylonian symbolism and Babylonian texts. And he may have, stretched things a bit, but, it's an interesting idea, and I don't categorically close the book on it. I say, it's possible, let's keep an open mind, but at this point I've seen very little hard evidence that such is the case.
Well, I don't get into it too much on this show, but I think it's interesting, and just like you, I keep an open mind. I collect puzzle pieces, and when they fit, they fit, and when they don't, I don't necessarily throw them away. I hold them off to the side and wait for them to fit. So it's about keeping an open, critical mind. We talk about the trivium a lot, which is critical thinking. It's grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and it's really important.
Yeah, the art of it is keeping that balance between open-mindedness and skepticism.
That's hard for people to do.
It is.
And that's there's an Aristotle quote that I love, that it's a mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it.
I like that.
Yeah, I do as well. It's the idea of being an agnostic thinker. So, and we got to do that, and that's something that I admire about your work, is that you seem to, incorporate that philosophy. You've gone on a number of different trips here. I guess nobody wanted to call in. 866-841-1065. I'll throw it out there. We'll have a chance to squeeze you in here if you want to still call. But let me ask you before we let you go, and we'll have to do this again. I've enjoyed it. You've done a number of different trips and expeditions. What's the best highlight from that?
Well, I do trips. My most recent one was to Egypt. I managed to get in just under the wire before the revolution broke out. I went as a guest to TravelEgypt.com, or Travel Egypt. TravelEgypt.com would be their website, and was able to do some research into the temple architecture and the symbolism there. And I came back with some very interesting stuff, which I probably couldn't get into tonight because we don't have time. Most of what I do is researching ancient cultures or researching evidence for catastrophic change in the geological record. So, I've gone extensively around North America documenting evidence for catastrophic change here, because in this last great global cataclysm that I was referring to at the end of the last ice age, it appears that North America might have been ground zero. And certainly the evidence that I've been looking at seems to support that contention.
We'll have to get into that some more in future shows. Let's try to get one final phone call here. Somebody did want to call in. Let's see here. Is this Bubba?
This is Bubba.
Go ahead, Bubba. What's on your mind?
Hey, I read something on the internet about Albert Pike driving this comet called Baphomet, right? And he's going to use Baphomet to create the New World Order. And that's all I wanted to say is I think Freemasons are just plain evil, because I've seen it on the internet. So I don't want to read nothing about it much, or even really consider different opinions or anything like that. But anyway, that's all I want to say about that.
All right. Thanks for the call.
Well, hey, if it's on the internet, it must be true, right?
Absolutely. That was part of the whole critical thinking we were just talking about, right?
That's right.
All right. I like your sense of humor as well. All right. We'll have Randall on again. Thanks again. One more time, your website is sacredgeometryinternational.com. Did I get it right?
Yes. And let me quickly say that I have a website devoted primarily to the Catastrophist research.
Okay.
And it's cosmographicresearch.org. Just as it sounds. cosmographicresearch.org.
All right. Thanks again, Randall, for coming on. We'll do it soon.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to doing this again.
All right, bye-bye. All right, folks. Well, I guess I can take your calls in the final segment tonight on anything you like, and I got some news for you we'll catch up on. Don't go anywhere.